And so the years turned into decades. The seasons changed to a relentless, indifferent rhythm. But within the walls of Blackwood Manor, time seemed to stand still, trapped in the amber of Eleanor's unending sorrow. Lord Alistair grew old and withered, his heart a shriveled, blackened thing, consumed by a guilt that he would never acknowledge, a remorse that he was too proud to express. He died alone and unloved, his vast fortune and his grand estate a cold, empty comfort in his final moments. The manor passed to distant relatives who had no love for the place, who saw it only as a burden, a relic of a bygone era. They would visit infrequently, their stays brief and uncomfortable, their laughter and their lively conversations sounding hollow and out of place in the heavy, somber silence of the house. They would speak of the strange, unsettling atmosphere of the manor, the feeling of being constantly watched by unseen eyes, the persistent, inexplicable sadness that seemed to seep from the very walls. They would hear the faint, mournful weeping on quiet nights and dismiss it as the wind whistling through the eaves, their rational minds unable to accept the possibility of a grief that could echo through the ages. The rose garden, once a vibrant testament to Eleanor's love and her passion for life, was now a tangled, overgrown wilderness, the thorny briars a twisted, skeletal reminder of a beauty that had long since faded. The mausoleum, once a pristine monument to Lord Alistair's possessive love, was now covered in moss and lichen, the inscription on its stone face worn and illegible, the name of the woman who lay within almost forgotten by the living world. But Eleanor did not forget. Her memory of Julian, of their stolen moments of happiness, of the love that had been so cruelly snatched away from them, remained as vivid and as poignant as the day he had died in her arms. Her spectral wanderings were a pilgrimage of remembrance, a tireless search for a love that she could never again hold. She would drift through the long, dust-filled corridors of the manor, her ghostly fingers tracing the patterns on the faded wallpaper, her ethereal form reflected for a fleeting moment in the grimy, time-tarnished mirrors. She would pause in the library, the scent of old leather and decaying paper a familiar comfort, and she would gaze out of the tall, narrow windows of the desolate, wind-swept moors, her spectral eyes seeing not the bleakness of the present, but the vibrant, untamed beauty of a past that was forever lost to her. She would linger in the drawing room, where the faint, ghostly notes of a harpsichord could sometimes be heard, a phantom melody that was a remnant of a happier time, a time when the house had been filled with music and laughter, and the promise of a future that would never come to be. Her presence was most strongly felt in her former bedchamber, a room that had been left untouched for decades, its furnishings shrouded in white dust cloths, like sleeping giants in a forgotten fairy tale. The air in this room was always colder than in the rest of the house, a palpable chill that was not of this world, a coldness that was born of a grief that could never be warmed by the sun. It was in this room that her weeping was the loudest, a sound of such profound and utter despair that it could break the heart of anyone who heard it. The villagers of Oakhaven continued to tell their stories, their tales of the Lady in Grey becoming a part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale for young lovers, a spooky story to be told around a crackling fire on a cold winter's night. The manor became a place of legend, a place to be avoided after dark, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin and porous. Children would dare each other to venture as far as the crumbling stone wall that marked the edge of the estate, their hearts pounding their chests, their imaginations running wild with images of ghostly apparitions and mournful cries. But no one ever dared to enter the grounds of Blackwood Manor, for they knew that it was a place of sorrow, a place where a broken heart still yearned for love that could never be. The story of Eleanor and Julian, though the names and the details had become blurred and distorted over time, was a reminder that some wounds are too deep to ever truly heal, that some grief is so powerful it can transcend the boundaries of life and death. The haunting of Blackwood Manor was not a thing of fear, but of pity, a quiet, pervasive sadness that was as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oak trees and the rolling, mist-shrouded hills. It was the story of a love that had been denied, a life that had been cut short, and a spirit that was destined to wander in a twilight world of memory and regret, forever searching for a peace that she would never find. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, a new family, the Ashworths, acquired the Blackwood estate, their newly acquired wealth from industrial endeavors affording them the luxury of a country manor. They were a practical, no-nonsense family, far removed from the landed aristocracy of the Blackwoods, and they arrived with grand plans of renovation and modernization. They saw the manor not as a place of history and secrets, but as a blank canvas upon which they could paint their own future. They were a boisterous and lively family, their energetic presence a stark contrast to the somber, heavy silence that had held sway over the house for so long. The children, Thomas and Emily, their laughter echoing to the long-neglected corridors, were initially thrilled by the prospect of exploring the vast, mysterious house and its overgrown grounds. They were not afraid of the stories they had heard in the village, dismissing them as the superstitious ramblings of simple country folk. They saw the manor as a grand adventure, a place of endless possibilities for games of hide-and-seek and imaginary quests. But as the days turned into weeks, a subtle, creeping unease began to permeate their youthful enthusiasm. They would speak of a strange, sad lady who would sometimes watch them from an upstairs window, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes filled with a longing that they could not comprehend. They would complain of a persistent chill in their playroom, a coldness that no fire could seem to dispel. They would wake in the night, startled by the sound of soft, mournful weeping, a sound that seemed to come from within the very walls of the house. Mrs. Ashworth, a woman of staunchly rational beliefs, dismissed her stories as a product of overactive imaginations, the result of too many ghost stories told by the servants. She was determined to banish the gloomy atmosphere of the manor, to fill its dark corners with light and laughter and the comforting routines of a well-ordered life. She had the heavy, dark curtains taken down, the windows scrubbed clean to lend the sunlight, and the dusty, cobweb-laden furniture replaced with newer, more fashionable pieces. She even went so far as to have the overgrown rose garden cleared, the tangled briars and the withered, dead bushes ripped out to make way for a manicured lawn and neat, orderly flower beds. She saw the garden as a symbol of the decay and neglect that she was determined to eradicate from her new home, and she was blissfully unaware of the significance of place, of the love and the loss that were so deeply embedded in its soil. This act of unknowing desecration seemed to stir something in the house, to awaken a deeper, more profound level of sorrow. The ghostly phenomena became more frequent, more pronounced. The scent of withered roses, once faint and almost imperceptible, now hung heavy in the air, a cloying, funereal fragrance that permeated every room. The sound of weeping, once only heard on the stillest of nights, now echoed to the house at all hours, a constant, heartbreaking lament. Doors would creak open on their own, even when there was no breeze, and objects would be moved from their places, not with a violent, poltergeist-like force, but with a gentle, almost hesitant touch, as if a ghostly hand were reaching out from the past, try to make its presence known. It was Emily, the younger of the two children, a sensitive and intuitive child, who first made a connection with the spectral lady of the manor. She was a quiet, solitary child, prone to daydreaming and flights of fancy, and she felt a strange, inexplicable kinship with the sad, unseen presence in the house. One afternoon, while exploring the dusty, forgotten attic, she stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant, faded handwriting. It was Eleanor's journal, a record of her hopes, her dreams, and her all-consuming love for Julian. As Emily read the words that had been written so long ago, the story of the tragic lovers unfolded before her, a story of stolen moments of happiness, of a love that had defied convention, and of a grief that had transcended the boundaries of time. She felt a profound sense of empathy for the sad, lonely spirit who still wandered the halls of the manor, and she began to understand that the haunting was not something to be feared, but something to be understood, to be pitied. She started to leave small offerings to the ghost, a single, perfect rose from a new garden on the windowsill of Eleanor's former bedchamber, a small, hand-drawn picture of two lovers holding hands left on the dusty mantelpiece. These small acts of kindness seemed to have a calming effect on the restless spirit. The weeping became less frequent, the scent of roses less overpowering. The feeling of pervasive sadness in the house began to lift ever so slightly. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing the places and times of day or night in the heart of Forgotten Valley. Nestled between mist-shrouded hills and ancient whispering woods stood Blackwood Manor, a place where time itself seemed to move at a slower, more deliberate pace. The The 1700s were drawing to a close, a century of enlightenment and reason. Yet within the cold stone walls of the manor, older, more primal forces held sway, a legacy of sorrow and secrets that clung to the very fabric of the building like the ivy that crept relentlessly up its weathered facade. The story of Blackwood Manor is not one of violent poltergeists or malevolent demons, but rather a tale of quiet, pervasive melancholy, a haunting born of love and loss, of promises broken, and a grief so profound it transcended the veil between the living and the dead. The air within the manor was always still, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and the faint, almost imperceptible fragrance of withered roses, a scent that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a place of shadows and echoes, where the past was not merely remembered but felt, a constant, unseen presence that walked the long, dark corridors and sighed in the empty rooms. The wind, as it wound its way through the gnarled branches of surrounding oak trees, seemed to carry with it the whispers of forgotten names and the fragment of conversations long since ended. The townsfolk in the nearby village of Oakhaven spoke of the manor in hushed tones, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, for they knew that Blackwood Manor was a place best left to its ghosts. They would tell tales of a spectral lady in a gray, tattered gown, seen gliding through the overgrown gardens at dusk, her form indistinct and ethereal, like a wisp of smoke caught in the twilight. They spoke of a gentle, mournful weeping that could sometimes be heard on the stillest of nights, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath the manor, a lament for a love that had been tragically cut short. The history of the manor was as long and as tangled as the thorny briars that choked its once beautiful rose garden. It had been built by Lord Alistair Blackwood, a man of great wealth and even greater ambition. In the early part of the century, he had carved his estate out of the wild, untamed landscape, a testament to his desire to impose order and control upon the natural world. The manor itself was a grand, imposing structure of dark gray stone, with tall, narrow windows that seemed like vacant eyes staring out over the desolate, wind-swept moors. It was a house built not for comfort, but for status, a reflection of his master's austere and unforgiving nature. Lord Alistair was a man of few words and even fewer emotions. His heart as hard and as cold as the stone for which his home was built. He had married a woman named Eleanor, a gentle soul with a spirit as bright and as fragile as a butterfly's wing. She was a light in his dark and joyless world, the only person who had ever been able to penetrate the formidable fortress of his heart. Eleanor loved the manor, but she also feared it, for she could feel the oppressive weight of its history, the lingering sorrows of those who had come before. She poured her heart and soul into creating a garden, a vibrant oasis of color and life in the midst of the bleak, monochromatic landscape. The rose garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the stifling confines of the manor and the suffocating presence of her husband. She spent countless hours tending to her beloved roses, her delicate fingers stained with earth, her face flushed with the simple joy of nurturing beauty in a place where it seemed so utterly out of place. It was in the rose garden that Eleanor first met him, a young, itinerant artist named Julian, who had been commissioned by Lord Alistair to paint a series of landscapes of the surrounding countryside. Julian was everything that Alistair was not. He was warm and passionate and full of life, his eyes sparkling with creative fire that mirrored the untamed beauty of the wilderness he so loved to paint. He saw in Eleanor a kindred spirit, a soul that yearned for freedom and beauty, and he was instantly captivated by her quiet grace and her gentle, melancholy smile. A secret, unspoken love blossomed between them, a love as fragile and as beautiful as the roses in Eleanor's garden. They would meet in secret, their stolen moments together a precious respite from the cold, suffocating reality of their lives. In the dappled sunlight of the rose garden, they would share their hopes and their dreams, their voices soft whispers carried on the gentle breeze. Julian would sketch her likeness, his charcoal pencil moving with a desperate urgency, as if he knew that their time together was fleeting, a transient moment of beauty that could not possibly last. He captured her essence on paper, the wistful sadness in her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile, the way a stray lock of her auburn hair would catch the light. These clandestine meetings were a dangerous game, for Lord Alistair was a jealous and possessive man, his love for Eleanor a twisted, suffocating thing that sought to control and to own. He saw her not as a person, but as a beautiful object, a prize to be displayed and admired, a testament to his own power and prestige. He watched her with a hawk-like intensity, his suspicions growing with each passing day, a dark, venomous seed of doubt taking root in his cold, barren heart. The inevitable discovery of their affair was as swift and as brutal as a summer storm breaking over the moors. Lord Alistair, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury, confronted them in the rose garden. The place that had been their sanctuary now transformed into a stage for a tragedy. The air grew thick with a palpable tension, the vibrant colors of the roses seeming to pale in the face of his icy rage. Julian, in a desperate, foolish act of defiance, stood before Eleanor, his slender frame no match for the hulking, imposing figure of the lord. There was a struggle, a flash of steel in the fading light of the setting sun, and then a cry, a single, sharp intake of breath that was swallowed by the sudden, deafening silence. Julian lay on the soft, dark earth, a single, perfect red rose blooming on his chest, its petals unfurling in a macabre parody of life. Eleanor's scream was a raw, primal sound of pure, unadulterated anguish, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the evening air. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands stained with the lifeblood of the man she had loved, her tears falling like rain on his pale, still face. In that moment, something within her broke, a light extinguished, leaving behind only a hollow, echoing emptiness. From that day forward, she was a ghost in her own home, her spirit having fled with Julian's last breath. She would wander the halls of the manor like a lost soul, her eyes vacant and unseeing, her once beautiful face a mask of perpetual sorrow. She would spend hours in the rose garden, her hands caressing the petals of the flowers that had been a silent witness to her stolen moments of happiness and her ultimate, devastating loss. The once vibrant garden began to wither and die, its beauty fading with the light in Eleanor's eyes, the roses drooping their heads as if in shared grief. Lord Alistair, consumed by a possessive madness, refused to let her go, even in death. When Eleanor finally succumbed to her grief, her frail body giving up the fight for a life that had become an unbearable torment, he had her entombed in a grand, ornate mausoleum at the edge of the rose garden, a cold, stone prison for her mortal remains. He believed that by keeping her close, he could somehow possess her forever, his love a twisted, selfish thing that could not comprehend the true meaning of letting go. But a spirit as gentle and as loving as Eleanor's could not be so easily contained. Her grief, her longing, her unfulfilled love for Julian were too powerful to be silenced by the cold finality of death. Her spirit remained, bound to the place that had been the scene of both her greatest joy and her deepest sorrow. She became the Lady in Grey, her spectral form a permanent fixture in the twilight landscape of Blackwood Manor. Her weeping was not a cry for vengeance, but lament for love that had been so cruelly taken from her, a love that she still yearned for, even in the shadowy realm of the afterlife. She was not a malevolent spirit, but a heartbroken one, her presence a constant, gentle reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within the manor's cold, unfeeling walls. Her ghostly apparitions were fleeting and ethereal, a glimpse of a tattered gray gown in the periphery, the faint scent of withered roses on the air, the soft, mournful sound of weeping carried on the wind. She was a ghost of memory, a whisper of a life that had been lived and lost, her story woven into the very fabric of Blackwood Manor, a sad, beautiful, and enduring tale of love that was stronger than death itself. Emily's attempts to explain her discovery to her parents were met with disbelief and a gentle, condescending amusement. They saw her connection with the ghost as a childish fantasy, a way of coping with the strangeness of their new home. But they could not deny the subtle, yet undeniable, change in the atmosphere of the manor. The house began to feel less like a cold, unwelcoming tomb and more like a home. The chill in the air dissipated, replaced by a sense of peace, of quiet resignation. It was as if Eleanor, in her ghostly solitude, had finally found a kindred spirit, someone who understood her sorrow, who acknowledged her pain. Emily's simple acts of compassion had provided a balm for a wound that had been festering for almost a century. The haunting of Blackwood Manor did not cease, for a grief as profound as Eleanor's could never be completely erased. But it changed. It became a gentler, more subtle presence, a quiet reminder of the love and the loss that were woven into the history of the house. The Lady in Grey was still seen from time to time, a fleeting, ethereal figure in the twilight, but her form seemed less sorrowful, her presence less heavy. The sound of weeping was rarely heard anymore, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound not of despair, but of a quiet, resigned acceptance. And so, Blackwood Manor continued to stand, a silent witness to the changing of the times, its stones saturated with the memories of the lives that had been lived and lost within its walls. The Ashworth family, though they never fully comprehended the nature of the presence that shared their home, learned to live with it, to respect its quiet sorrow. The story of Eleanor and Julian became a part of their own family history, a tale to be passed down through the generations, a reminder of the enduring power of love and the indelible imprint that human emotion can leave on a place. The manor was no longer just a house of stone and mortar, but a repository of memory, a living, breathing entity with a heart that had been broken long ago, but which had, through the simple, unassuming kindness of a child, begun the slow, arduous process of healing. The wind that whistled to the eaves no longer sounded like a mournful cry, but like a soft, gentle whisper, a lullaby for a spirit that had finally found a measure of peace. The shadows in the long, dark corridors seemed less menacing, the silence less oppressive. Blackwood Manor was still a haunted house, but its haunting was no longer a thing of sadness and despair, but a testament to the resilience of the human heart, a story of a love that, even in death, had refused to be forgotten. The faint, sweet scent of roses will forever linger in the air, a fragrant reminder of a love that had bloomed in a secret garden, a love that had been tragically cut short, but which had, in its own quiet, ghostly way, managed to endure. The lady in gray still walked the halls, her presence a gentle, almost comforting one, a silent guardian of the memories that were her only remaining treasure, her eternal vigil a testament to a love that was as timeless and as enduring as the ancient, mist-shrouded hills that cradled Blackwood Manor in their silent, watchful embrace. As the seasons cycled through their endless waltz of birth, life, and decay, Emily Ashworth grew from a curious child into a thoughtful young woman, her life inextricably intertwined with the silent, sorrowful spirit of Blackwood Manor. Her secret companionship with the lady in gray, as she had come to call Eleanor in her private thoughts, was a constant, gentle undercurrent in the river of her days. She never spoke of it again to her family, having learned early on that their world of logic and reason had no room for the delicate, unseen threads that connected her to the manor's past. Instead, her understanding became a quiet, personal ritual, a silent conversation carried on through small gestures and a shared, unspoken empathy. She would still leave a single rose in Eleanor's room, a tradition that continued long, after the rest of the new garden had been filled with more practical, less romantic blooms. She found that she could feel Eleanor's presence most keenly not in moments of fear or surprise, but in moments of quiet contemplation, when she would sit by the window in the library, a book resting unread in her lap, and simply listen to the house breathe around her. In these moments, she would sometimes feel a subtle shift in the air, a faint coolness that was not unpleasant, a fleeting scent of withered roses that was no longer a sign of grief, but of acknowledgement of a shared solitude. She learned to read the moods of the house, to sense when Eleanor's sorrow was a dull, persistent ache, and when it was a sharper, more poignant memory, perhaps stirred by a particular quality of the light or the sound of a distant storm gathering over the moors. Emily's unique connection to the manor's spectral inhabitants shaped her in subtle but profound ways. She developed a deep and abiding love for history, for the stories that lay hidden in old objects and forgotten places. She would spend hours poring over the local archives, piecing together the fragmented history of the Blackwood family, seeking to give a name and a face to the ghostly presence that was her constant companion. She learned of Lord Alistair's cold ambition, of Eleanor's gentle spirit, and she even found a brief, passing mention of a young artist named Julian, who had been commissioned to paint landscapes of the estate, his name a mere footnote in the grand, sweeping narrative of the Blackwood dynasty. But for Emily, this footnote was a heart of the story, the missing piece that explained the enduring sorrow that clung to the very stones of her home. She became the keeper of Eleanor's memory, the silent guardian of a love story that the world had long since forgotten. This preoccupation with the past made her seem somewhat detached from the present, a little distant, a little strange to the other young people of her acquaintance. She was in the world, but not entirely of it, her thoughts often drifting back to a time she had never known, her heart attuned to a grief that was not her own. She never married, though she had her share of suitors, for she could not imagine sharing her life, her home, with someone who could not understand the delicate, unseen tapestry of memory and emotion that was woven into the very fabric of Blackwood Manor. Her life was one of quiet solitude, but she was never truly alone, for she shared her home with a spirit who, in a strange and beautiful way, had become her oldest and dearest friend. As the years advanced, and Emily's hair turned from a rich chestnut to a soft, silvery gray, her connection with Eleanor deepened, becoming a source of comfort rather than a cause for unease. The house seemed to settle around her, its ghostly sighs and whispers becoming a familiar part of its everyday language. The manor, under her gentle stewardship, was no longer a place of pervasive sadness, but one of profound and peaceful melancholy. She allowed the rose garden to grow wild once more, not as a tangled, choked wilderness, but as a rambling, romantic profusion of color and scent, a tribute to the woman who had first planted it so many years ago. She would spend her afternoons there, sitting on a weathered stone bench, reading Eleanor's journal, the words on the page now as familiar to her as her own thoughts. She felt a deep sense of responsibility for the gentle spirit who was bound to house, a need to protect her from a world that would not understand, that would seek to sensationalize or to exorcise her quiet, unobtrusive sorrow. She became a buffer between the house and the outside world, her reclusive nature a protective shield around its fragile, haunted heart. Visitors were few and far between, and those who did come were often struck by the strange, timeless quality of the place, the feeling of stepping into a world that was out of sync with the relentless, forward march of progress. They would speak of the house in hushed, reverent tones, sensing that it was a place that held more secrets than it would ever reveal. In the final years of her life, as her own mortal frame grew frail and her steps became slow and measured, Emily began to think about what would become of Eleanor when she was gone. The thought filled her with a deep, aching sadness, the fear that the spirit she had come to know and love would be left alone once more, her story forgotten, her grief misunderstood. She began to write her own account, a detailed history of the manor's haunting, not as a ghost story, but as a love story, a plea for understanding and compassion for the gentle, heartbroken spirit who was its eternal inhabitant. She wrote of her own experiences, of the subtle signs of Eleanor's presence, of the quiet, unspoken companionship that had enriched her own solitary life. She placed her manuscript alongside Eleanor's journal, tucking them away in a secret drawer in the library, a legacy of understanding for whoever might come after her. Her last days were spent in quiet contemplation, her gaze often fixed on the tall, narrow window of her bedchamber, as if she were waiting for a final, farewell glimpse of the lady in gray. She died peacefully in her sleep one autumn night, the air in her room filled with a faint, sweet scent of roses, a final, fragrant goodbye from a grateful spirit. Her passing was as quiet and as unobtrusive as her life had been, and with her went the only living soul who truly understood the heart of Blackwood Manor. The manor, now without its gentle keeper, seemed to hold its breath, a profound and heavy silence descending upon its empty rooms. The subtle, almost peaceful melancholy that characterized a haunting during Emily's lifetime began to shift, to deepen, the old, raw sorrow of Eleanor's grief beginning to resurface, no longer tempered by the comforting presence of a kindred spirit. The sound of weeping, which had been silent for so many decades, began to be heard once more, a faint, mournful echo in the dead of night. The house fell into the hands of a distant cousin, a man with no emotional connection to the place, who saw it only as a valuable piece of property to be sold to the highest bidder. And so, for the first time in over a century, Blackwood Manor was put on the market, its secrets and its sorrows now a commodity to be bought and sold. It was purchased by a wealthy industrialist from the city, a man named Mr. Harrington, who had a wife and 2 young sons. The Harringtons were much like the Ashworths had been when they first arrived, practical, modern, and utterly dismissive of the local legends that clung to the manor like the morning mist. They saw the house as a status symbol, a grand country estate where they could entertain their fashionable friends and escape the grime and the noise of the city. They arrived with an army of servants and decorators, their intention to strip the house of its gloomy, old-fashioned character and to transform it into a bright, modern, and fashionable home. The renovations began with a ruthless efficiency. The old, dark wood paneling was painted over in light, Cheerful colors, the heavy, brocaded curtains were replaced with light, airy fabrics, and the old, creaking furniture was carted away to be sold at auction. The house, which had stood for so long as a monument to the past, was being forcibly dragged into the present. Its history and its memories being papered over, painted out, and discarded. This violent disruption of the manor's long slumber had a profound and unsettling effect on its spectral inhabitant. Eleanor's gentle, sorrowful presence began to take on a more desperate, more agitated quality. Her weeping became more frequent, more intense, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish that could no longer be dismissed as the wind. The scent of roses, once a subtle, almost pleasant fragrance, now became an overpowering, cloying funereal stench that would appear and disappear without warning. Doors would not just creak open, but slam shut with a violent, startling force. Cold spots would move through the rooms like unseen, icy rivers, and the servants would speak in hushed, frightened whispers of a gray, spectral figure that would appear at the top of the grand staircase, its form more distinct, more solid than it had ever been before, its spectral eyes filled with a look of desperate, pleading despair. The Harrington family, though they tried to maintain a brave, rational facade, could not ignore the increasingly malevolent atmosphere of their new home. Mrs. Harrington began to suffer from terrible nightmares, her sleep plagued by images of a weeping woman and the scent of dying roses. The two young boys, once boisterous and full of life, became quiet and withdrawn, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear that they could not articulate. They refused to sleep in their own rooms, claiming that a sad lady would stand at the foot of their beds at night, her silent weeping filling the room with an unbearable sadness. The climax came one stormy winter's night, when the wind howled around the manor, like a banshee and the rain lashed against the tall, narrow windows. The Harringtons were hosting a dinner party, their drawing room filled with the bright, cheerful chatter of their city friends, a forced gaiety that did little to dispel the oppressive, heavy atmosphere of the house. Suddenly, in the midst of the party, all the candles in the room were extinguished at once, plunging the room into a deep, disorienting darkness. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a moment of nervous, uncomfortable laughter. But the laughter died in their throats as a low, mournful wail rose from somewhere deep within the house, a sound of such profound and utter grief that it seemed to make the very air vibrate. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from just outside the drawing-room door. The heavy oak door, which had been firmly closed, began to rattle in its frame, as if an unseen force were trying to break it down. Panic erupted in the room, the guests scrambling in the darkness, their fashionable civility forgotten in the face of a primal, terrifying fear. Mr. Harrington, his face a mask of pale, sweat-sheen terror, managed to relight a single candle, its small, flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In that moment, the rattling stopped and profound, deathly silence descended upon the room. And then, slowly, silently, the drawing-room door swung open, revealing the long, dark corridor beyond. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure of a woman in a tattered gray gown, her form shimmering and indistinct, her face obscured by shadow, but the palpable aura of her overwhelming sorrow was a physical force that washed over the room in an icy, suffocating wave. The apparition lasted for only a moment, but it was enough. The guests fled the manor in a state of blind panic, their carriages clattering away into the stormy night, leaving the Harringtons alone in their vast, terrifying new home. That night, no one in the Harrington family slept. They huddled together in the master bedroom, a fire roaring in the hearth, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, listening to the sound of the house, the mournful weeping of the lady in gray, the creaking of the floorboards as she paced the long, empty corridors, her sorrow now a tangible, threatening presence. The next morning, as the first weak rays of the winter sun penetrated the gloom, the Harringtons packed their belongings and left Blackwood Manor, never to return. They had tried to impose their will upon the house, to erase its past, but the past had risen up to meet them, its grief too powerful, its memory too deeply ingrained to be so easily dismissed. The manor was once again left to its silence and its shadows, its sorrow now deeper, more profound than ever before. The story of the Harringtons' terrifying dinner party spread like wildfire, cementing Blackwood Manor's reputation as a place of true and malevolent haunting. The house remained empty for many years, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the overgrown, neglected grounds. The townsfolk of Oakhaven would point to it from a distance, their voices low and hushed, their stories now filled with new and more potent fear. The lady in gray was no longer seen as a gentle, heartbroken spirit, but as a vengeful, dangerous one, a ghost who would not tolerate the intrusion of the living. Mr. Abernathy rarely entered the manor itself after dusk, not out of fear, but out of a profound sense of respect for its spectral inhabitant. He felt that the nights belonged to Eleanor, that it was her time to walk the long, dark corridors, to relive her memories in the silent, moonlit rooms, and he would not intrude upon her solitary vigil. But during the day, he would move through the house with a quiet, respectful familiarity, dusting the furniture with a soft, gentle touch, his presence a comforting, unobtrusive one. He learned the language of the house, the subtle creaks and groans of its ancient timbers, the way the light fell through the tall, narrow windows at different times of the day, the particular quality of the silence that was its most constant companion. He never saw the lady in gray, not as a distinct visual apparition, but he felt her presence everywhere. He would feel a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air as he passed the doorway to her former bedchamber, or he would catch the faint, fleeting scent of withered roses in the library, a fragrant sigh from a time long past. On the stillest of nights, when he would sit on the porch of a small cottage, a cup of tea warming his gnarled hands, he would sometimes hear it, the soft, mournful sound of weeping carried on a gentle breeze, and he would simply nod to himself, a silent acknowledgement of a grief that he had come to understand and to respect. He was not a companion to the ghost in the way that Emily Ashworth had been, for he was a man of a different time and a different temperament, but he was a gentle, unassuming guardian, a silent sentinel who watched over her sorrow with a quiet, compassionate heart. The manor was open to the public on a limited basis, a few days a week during the summer months. Small groups of visitors would be led to the carefully preserved rooms, their voices unnaturally loud and intrusive in the heavy, somber silence. Mr. Abernathy would act as their guide, his commentary delivered in a low, measured monotone, his words focused on the history of the architecture, the provenance of furniture, the details of the Blackwood family's lineage. He never spoke of the haunting, for he felt that to do so would be to cheapen it, to turn Eleanor's profound and private grief into a cheap, sensationalist thrill for the curious. But the visitors felt it nonetheless. They would walk into the house, their cheerful, holiday chatter gradually falling away, replaced by a sense of quiet, contemplative awe. They would comment on the strange, pervasive sadness of the place, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, the inexplicable chill that seemed to cling to the very air. Some, the more sensitive among them, would be visibly moved, their eyes welling with tears for a reason they could not explain, their hearts touched by a sorrow that resonated on a deep, primal level. Others, the more skeptical and prosaic, would feel nothing but a sense of mild disappointment, seeing only a dusty, old house that was in desperate need of a good airing out. It seemed that the manor and the spirit that inhabited it had a way of revealing itself only to those who were open to its subtle, sorrowful beauty, a secret language that could only be heard by a listening heart. The years continued their slow, relentless march, and the world outside the gates of Blackwood Manor changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the people who had first lived and loved and suffered within its cold stone walls. The horse-drawn carriages that had once clattered up the long, winding drive were replaced by noisy, sputtering motor cars. The soft, flickering light of candles and oil lamps gave way to the harsh, steady glare of electric bulbs, though Mr. Abernathy, in a quiet act of defiance, insisted that the manor itself should never be electrified, arguing that its shadows were as much a part of its character as its stones. Great wars raged across the continent, their distant, thunderous echoes barely penetrating the deep, timeless peace of the valley. Where the manor stood, generations were born and died, fashions came and went, empires rose and fell, but within the walls of Blackwood Manor, the story remained the same. It was a place out of time, an anchor in the swirling, chaotic currents of history. Its central, defining feature the unchanging, eternal sorrow of a woman who had died for love almost 2 centuries before. The lady in gray continued her spectral wanderings, her ethereal form a permanent, unchanging feature of the manor's landscape, her soft, mournful weeping the house's constant, heartbreaking lullaby. She was a ghost not just of a person, but of a time, a remnant of an age when emotions were deeper, sorrows were more profound, and a broken heart could be a fatal affliction. When old Mr. Abernathy finally passed away, as peacefully and as quietly as he had lived, the Historical Society found it difficult to find a replacement. The world was a busier, more practical place now, and the role of the solitary, live-in caretaker for a remote, haunted house held little appeal for most. For a time, the manor was looked after by a rotating staff of volunteers, well-meaning people who would drive out from the nearby town to dust the rooms and to guide the few visitors who still made the pilgrimage to the lonely, forgotten estate. But the house seemed to resent this impersonal, transient care. The ghostly phenomena, which had been so quiet and so gentle during Mr. Abernathy's long tenure, began to grow more pronounced once more. The weeping became more frequent, the cold spots more intense, and the feeling of pervasive sadness deepened into a palpable sense of desolation and loneliness. It was as if Eleanor, having grown accustomed to the quiet, respectful companionship of the old historian, was now feeling the keen, sharp pang of her solitude more acutely than ever before. It became clear that Blackwood Manor did not just need a caretaker. It needed a keeper, a guardian, a living soul to share its long and lonely vigil. And then, one day, she arrived. Her name was Clara May, a young woman in her late 20s, a librarian and an amateur historian who had been captivated by the story of the manor ever since reading Arthur Penhaligon's book as a young girl. She had applied for the caretaker position on a whim, never imagining that she would be chosen, but there was something in her quiet intensity, her deep, scholarly knowledge of the manor's history, and her obvious, heartfelt empathy for the spirit of Eleanor Blackwood that convinced the board of the Historical Society to take a chance on her. Clara was, in many ways, a modern-day Emily Ashworth. She was a solitary soul, more comfortable in the company of books and ghosts than she was with people her own time. She came to the manor not as an employee, but as a pilgrim, her heart filled with a sense of purpose and a deep, abiding desire to offer comfort to the lonely, heartbroken spirit who was its eternal inhabitant. She moved into the small caretaker's cottage, and from the very first day, the house seemed to recognize her as a kindred spirit. The heavy, desolate atmosphere began to lift. The mournful weeping subsided, and the old, familiar feeling of peaceful, profound melancholy returned. Clara's relationship with Eleanor was different from that of her predecessors. It was more direct, more intimate. She would speak to the ghost as she moved through the house, her voice a soft, gentle murmur, telling her about her day, reading passages from books of poetry, or simply describing the changing of the seasons in the world outside the manor's walls. She discovered the two journals in the secret drawer of the library, and she would spend her evenings reading them by the light of a single oil lamp, feeling the presence of the two women who had written them, Eleanor and Emily, as if they were sitting in the room with her, their spirits intertwined across the centuries. Clara did not just see herself as a caretaker of a house, but as a custodian of a legacy of female companionship and understanding, a chain of empathy that stretched back to the young girl who had first offered a rose to a weeping ghost. She reopened the manor to the public, but she changed the nature of the tours. She no longer focused on the dry, historical facts of the architecture and the furniture, but instead, she told the story of Eleanor and Julian, her voice filled with a quiet, compassionate emotion that often moved her listeners to tears. She presented the haunting not as a scary story, but as a tragic love story. And in doing so, she transformed the experience of visiting Blackwood Manor from one of morbid curiosity to one of profound and heartfelt empathy.